Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Hope Church. If you're new, my name is Jason. I'm the lead pastor on staff, and today we are in part 2 of our series, Right in the Eye. In your seat this morning, there is a little card. Go ahead and grab that right now if you haven't taken a look at it. It says right at the eye at the top, and then it says questionnaire. If you haven't taken a look at that yet, here's what I'm asking you to do. While I'm talking, go ahead and look through those 4 questions and fill out your answers to those 4 questions. Don't write your name on it. You're not going to turn it in. No one else is going to see this. In fact, if you think about it too much, it won't work. Just give your knee-jerk reaction. Some of you high school students, that's your plan for finals this week. Just bring that right on into church. Just don't think about it. Just blurt out the first answer through your pen. Blurt it out. Write it down. And while you're filling that out, I'm going to tell you a little story. 3 months ago, Kathy and I were invited to Arizona for a wedding, and we thought, this is great. It's March in Arizona. We'll make a little vacation out of it. We love Arizona, beautiful state, lots of great hiking. We love the outdoors. The problem was I was recovering from my first knee surgery, and any walk more than a mile just wasn't going to work. So we had an idea. Let's rent a Jeep Wrangler. That way, it can do the hiking for us. So we picked it up at the airport, rent a car. We said, are you okay doing the hiking for us? It said, absolutely. Where do you want to go? So we went out on the trails. Now, I've never been like for real off-roading before. I've been on plenty of gravel roads, dirt roads, things like that, but never like legit Jeep Wrangler 4-wheel drive off-roading before, so I was kind of excited. So I did a little research online, watched some YouTube videos on how not to total your Jeep if you're a newbie, and in the Sedona area, found some trails that people said, yeah, these are good for noobs, okay? So if you don't know what you're doing, this trail is a great place to start. And I said, perfect, that's where we'll start. So one afternoon, Kathy and I, we head out in the Jeep. And, once you're off the highways, you're in the desert. There's no signal for your phone or anything like that. But we found a trail. We found a cool-looking destination. We said, well, let's get there. So we get off-road. We get on the trail, and it's a long trail, and we're just going, and we're having fun. What I didn't realize is there's not just one trail. There's these little ATV trails that branch off from the main trail in several places, and none of them are marked. So I thought, well, I'll just keep going down the one that looks like the right one, the one that looks like the main trail. We'll just keep going down it. Well, inevitably, of course, I take a branch off the main trail without even realizing I'm taking a branch off the main trail. And, the trail kind of gets rockier and slower and narrower and rockier and narrower until finally, a couple miles in, an hour into this trail, I realize we're out of trail. We got to the end of the trail, and, it looks like a couple ATVs drove through here a couple years ago is kind of all that's left of this trail. So we thought, well, now what do we do? We're out in the middle of the desert. We don't know where we are, and, we're out of trail. Now, I want to pause for a moment because some of you are going to be really disappointed because normally when I tell a story like this, it ends with me getting a broken rib on a jet ski or Kathy being covered in baby vomit. Something interesting usually happens at the end of the story. So what happened at the end of this story is pretty simple. We stopped and we got out of the Jeep and we took a look at this stunning view at the end of the trail. That's where the trail led us. We were not where we were supposed to be, but we said, man, this is beautiful. And we just got out and we appreciated the incredible view for a while. And then we turned around and took the trail back to the main trail and finished our off-wheel drive for the day. Now, the reason why nothing bad happened in this story is simple. We were on vacation. We had all day long, we had nothing but time, and we had a full tank of gas, so it's great. And this kind of is the purpose of off-roading, right? This is the point. It's all about the journey. It's all about, hey, let's go explore. Let's go see what we can see. Let's go find something brand new and have a little bit of adventure. It's all about the journey, not the destination. That's what we say. Now, the problem is, we bring this philosophy, life's a journey, not a destination, we bring it into our normal, everyday lives. And we say things like, life's a journey, not a destination. Now, to be sure, life is a journey, right? It is. It's an adventure. You don't always know what you're going to get, but here's the problem. Life is also a series of destinations. And once you live long enough, you realize, whether you intended to or not, you start hitting some very specific destinations in your life on your way to your final destination. Your life has an ending point. Your life has a final destination, and it has several destinations along the way. The question is, in this journey of life, Are you the kind of person who's going to end up somewhere by accident, or are you going to end up somewhere on purpose? Well, today we're in part 2 of our series, Right in the Eye, and what we're doing in this series is we are looking at an Old Testament book of the Bible. It's not a very familiar book of the Bible. It's called the book of Judges, and to understand the historical context, we have to begin with the life of a man named Moses. In the year 1446 BC, Moses famously went to Egypt, and he went to Pharaoh, and he said, "Let my people go," because the Israelite nation was held in economic and in social slavery, in bondage against their will by the Egyptian dynasty of that time. They were forced into slave labor. Moses went there to liberate the people and give them their freedom. He led them out of Egypt, across the Sinai Peninsula, on a journey to their ancestral homeland. It's called the Promised Land. Today it's the nation of Israel. Back then it was called the land of Canaan, but Moses led them on this journey. Well, Moses knew he wasn't going to live forever. None of us do. He knew he had a final destination. So while he led, he also apprenticed a younger leader by the name of Joshua, so that when he died, Joshua could take over leadership and there would be a seamless transition, and that's exactly what happened. Moses died, Joshua took over when they got to the Promised Land, and then Joshua led the people into this land. Well, eventually, of course, Joshua dies. Joshua died around the year 1380 BC, and the time of the judges that we're looking at in this series is this era of history in between 1380 BC and 1050 BC, because what happened in 1050 BC is King Saul became the first king of the nation of Israel. At that point, the nation officially switched to a monarchy government with a king. But in this era of the judges, there was no monarchy, there was no king. And the reason why is because Moses set the whole thing up not to be a monarchy, not to be a democracy. He set the whole thing up to be a theocracy. He set it up to be a nation of law where people submitted to the law of God. And as they honored the law of God, what God said about the nation, what God said about morals, what God said about values, what God said about worship, as the nation conducted themselves in answer to God, God was supposed to be their king, and they would all do the right thing in the eyes of God. Now, in theory, that's an incredible government. Think about it. Imagine if in America today, every single American said, "I'm just going to believe in God and do the right thing." Let's make it a little narrower. Let's pretend for a minute, every single American said, "I believe that Jesus died on a cross for my sins, and then he rose on the third day, and I'm going to obey the golden rule. I'm going to love my neighbor as myself." In fact, what if we took it up a notch? What if every single American said, "I'm going to obey not the golden rule, I'm going to obey the platinum rule"? Jesus said, "As I have loved you, you also must love one another." Now imagine a nation in which every single citizen said, "We're doing the platinum rule. As Jesus loved me, I'm going to love every single person around me." Do you know what would happen to our need for a centralized government if every single citizen decided just to do that? It would nearly vanish overnight. Most government offices would close their doors. We wouldn't need police forces. We wouldn't need a social security administration. Everyone would just take care of everyone. It would be a much lower taxed, nicer place to live. It's the kind of civilization we say, you know what, that kind of sounds good, to be honest. I would kind of like to live in a place like that. That's the setup that they had. And Moses said, you are going to thrive, you are going to flourish, you are going to prosper if you do what is right in the eyes of God. The problem was, after Joshua died, with his influence on the people stopped doing what was right in God's eyes, and as we saw last week, they started doing what was right in their own eyes. In other words, as long as it makes sense to me, as long as I can justify my actions in my own eyes, then who are you to tell me what to do? Who is God to tell me what to do? I'm going to do what is right in my own eyes. Or as we said it last week, it's very similar to the American value. I deserve the right to do what I want, when I want, with whomever I want. This is America. I deserve the right to do what I want, when I want, with whomever I want. Now, the problem with this is, if you pursue this philosophy for long enough, it will lead to chaos. As I said last week, if you pursue this philosophy long enough, you're going to need a lawyer. And then if you keep pursuing it, you're going to need your own law firm, because you will create chaos if you live out this philosophy in your life. In fact, there's only two groups of people preaching this message in society. The first are the entertainers who try and entertain us with escapist fantasies. Wouldn't it be great to be able to do what I want, when I want, with whomever I want, and not have to go to work on Monday morning? Yeah, that'd be awesome when we daydream that way, perhaps. And the other group of people that preach this message are the people who are 3 months away from divorce, bankruptcy, or jail time. Because when you do what you want, when you want, with whomever you want, it leads to unhinged chaos in your life. And last week, as we began our series on the book of Judges, we started at the very end of the story. And the reason why we started at the end of the story was because the narrator wanted us, the reader, to understand something. When you adopt this philosophy in life, when you take this approach to life, it has a predictable and specific destination in your life. This is why you will never, ever hear a Wisconsin Child Protective Service counselor sit down parents and say, we had to take your children away, but as soon as you can consistently demonstrate an ability to do what you want, when you want, with whomever you want, you'll get your kids back. You will never hear a judge say this, a parole officer say this, a dean of students say this, or a parent say this to their teenager. Because we know this leads to disintegration and chaos in life. Now today, what we're going to do is we're going to rewind all the way to the beginning of the story of Judges. In fact, we're actually going to look at the preface to the story of Judges today. And what we're going to discover today is so powerful and it is so insightful. But it's so subtle, we might miss it if we're not looking for it. Because in the preface to the book of Judges, the narrator gives us stunning insight and stunning wisdom. If your life has started to reach some unpleasant destinations, some destinations you didn't want to arrive at with your relationships, with your finances, with your emotional health, with your anxiety, with your relationship with God. Maybe God seems far away in your life. If your life has begun to arrive at some unpleasant destinations, or if you love the destinations you're hitting in life and you just don't want to mess it up, today the narrator of Judges shows us something. He shows us how people take their first step off course. How people take their first step off the path that God has for us for true human flourishing. And it doesn't matter what area of life you're talking about. It doesn't even matter if you're a spiritual person. It doesn't matter if you're a Christian. It is the same first step off course every single time. And here's why it's important. Just like with my Jeep, I just took a path that barely branched off the main trail, but pretty soon I ended up an hour off course. Or if you're taking off from Los Angeles to fly to New York, if you're just a couple of degrees off course, you'll end up hundreds of miles off target. In the same way, there is a consistent place that we as human beings get just a couple of degrees off course in life. And when we get just a couple of degrees off course, pretty soon we end up hopelessly lost, arriving at all kinds of destinations where we never wanted to arrive. And today, the reason why I think today is worth the price of your attention is because the narrator shows us exactly where that happens, and here's the good news. If you have found yourself off the path in life, if you have found yourself not reaching the right destinations at any point in your life today the narrator is going to give you the tools to back up to the place where you got off track and get back on track to your desired destinations. So before we look at Judges, we're actually going to back all the way up to Joshua today. We're going to look at something from the life of Joshua. When Joshua took over leadership of the people to enter the promised land, he addressed all the leaders of all the people of Israel, and he said this to them in Joshua chapter 1. Be strong and very courageous. Here's why he had to say, be strong and very courageous. The promised land they were about to enter was already occupied. And the people didn't want to say, here's the keys, have a great time, we'll leave you alone. So they had to be strong and they had to be courageous. Be careful. This doesn't just happen by itself. It requires intention. Be careful to obey all the law my servant Moses gave you. Do not turn from it to the right or to the left. Don't turn off this main trail, that you may be successful wherever you go. See, God says, you know what I want for you? I don't want restriction on your life. I want flourishing in your life. I want true shalom, peace, flourishing, wholeness, success in your life, and I am showing you the path to get there. Then you will be prosperous and successful. Now, here's what's fascinating. When Joshua speaks to the people, he speaks to them the way, honestly, the way we spoke to our children when they were younger. Now, when our children were younger and we wanted to teach them that we live in a cause and effect kind of world, we often use these when-then statements or these if-then statements. You know what I mean? Where you take a young child and basically say, when you choose to do this, then this will happen. If you choose to transgress this line, then that will happen. That way, they're in control. They can choose to cross the line if they want to, but they already know going in, when, then, it's a cause and effect kind of world. Joshua treats the people the same way. If you are careful to obey the Lord, then you will be successful. Then you will be prosperous. If you are careful, let's go get them on 3. So they go and they start to take over the promised land. Now, by the time he dies, about 24 years later, they're about halfway done. They have displaced about half the people who lived in the land. They have now taken control of about halfway through the land, and Joshua knows, well, it's getting to the end of my life too. So he gathers all the leaders of the people together again, and he says, okay, guys, few final things before I die. Here's elderly Joshua speaking to the people in Joshua 23. But here's our if then, if you turn away from God, if you turn away from his path, if you turn away from obeying him, and ally yourselves with the survivors of these nations that remain among you, and if you intermarry with them and associate with them, then you may be sure that the Lord your God will no longer drive out these nations before you. Now, let's back out of the story for a minute and see exactly what God is trying to accomplish in this whole conquest thing anyway. Some people wrongly assume that this is nothing but naked imperialism. But it's fascinating that God commands the people, no, you drive the people out. You don't keep their money. You don't keep their livestock. You don't get to enslave them. You must purge this from your land because it is evil. Now, perhaps you've looked at different aspects of our broken world before, and you have thought to yourself, if God is good, why doesn't he do something about that? When you see evil in this world, you think, if God is good, why doesn't he do something about that kind of evil? That's just wrong. That's just wicked. That's just evil. Well, this was a case in history where God said, I'm going to do something about that. The Canaanite culture was unspeakably wicked. This was a culture where women not only had no rights, women were treated as if they were nothing but property. This was a culture in which children had no value. In fact, archaeologists have discovered that the ancient Canaanites who lived in this land practiced child sacrifice as part of their worship of pagan deities. Their god, Baal, the rain god, sometimes they would have to sacrifice their own children in order to try and persuade Baal to send the rain on the land. Hey, we really mean it, Baal. We'll kill our children if you can send us some rain. Another ancient god of the era, the god of Moloch, they have found altars to Moloch where there's a statue of Moloch holding his hands like this. They would place their babies in his hands of the statue and then light a fire underneath it until the baby died as part of the worship of this pagan deity. This was a land of just evil, of horrible and complete lack of values and decency and no respect for human life. And God said, I am stamping out this kind of evil. And I'm using you to stamp out this kind of evil. You are not to enrich yourself through this conquest. You get to keep nothing. We are eliminating this level of evil from the land. That's why God says, I don't want you to intermarry with them. I don't want you to associate with them. I don't want you to make treaties with them. You are not to be allies with them. Drive them out of the land and keep a barrier between you and this kind of evil. Instead, if you marry with them, if you associate with them, if you start to worship their gods, instead of driving them out, they will become snares and traps for you, whips on your backs and thorns in your eyes. See, last week at the end of the story, we saw how everyone did what was right in his own eyes. It's because they couldn't see anymore, because they were enslaved by this wicked culture. Until you perish from this good land which the Lord your God has given you. Now, God's not saying you will literally become slaves. He's saying you're going to be mastered by these evil values. And that's how life works, right? Whatever in your life today you would say, this has mastered me and I want to be free from it, whether it's an addiction or an unhealthy habit or a way of speaking that's ruining your relationships or anger that lives in your heart, whatever has mastered you in your life today, it began as an expression of your freedom. I'll do what I want, when I want, with whomever I want. And God said, if you pursue that path instead of doing what is right in my eyes, you're going to be enslaved. Clear enough? No. Joshua says it again. If you violate, there's our word, if you violate the covenant of the Lord your God, which he commanded you, and go and serve other gods and bow down to them, the Lord's anger will burn against you, and you will quickly perish from the good land he has given you. So Joshua says, let me be crystal clear. There is going to be a destination in your future. Which one will it be? If you serve God faithfully, then you will be successful and prosper because God is for your flourishing. But if you turn away from God and serve these foreign gods, then you will become mastered. So here's his conclusion to his speech. Now then, said Joshua, throw away the foreign gods that are among you. Ladies, check your purses, check your center consoles, check your glove boxes, look under the bed, check all your drawers, everyone. Purge the foreign gods, the idolatry from among you. Get rid of it all, he says, and yield your hearts to the Lord, the God of Israel. Say, Joshua, don't you mean yield our behavior to the Lord God of Israel? He says, no, it's not what God wants. Did you know that if God was interested in flawless behavior, he would have made you in a way that you had no choice but to obey him, if that's what God is really interested in? But God says, what I'm really interested in is your hearts, because God at his heart is love, and he is filled with love for people. And what he wants in response is people who love him. You can't force love. Love has to be voluntarily given. So Joshua says, this is about the God who is love, and I want you to yield your hearts to God, which raises a question. How do we know if we've yielded our hearts to God? What does that mean? We don't really use that language too often. What's interesting is in this whole speech from Joshua, we see a litmus test that we can apply to our lives today. Is your heart yielded to the Lord? Is your heart yielded to God? There is a specific tension to pay attention to in your life that will be a pretty clear indicator on how yielded your heart is to the Lord. And here's what it is. It's our first fill in the blank if you're taking notes in your program. Here's the question. Is God for you? Or is he keeping something from you? That's it. When you look at your life, and when you look at what God asks of your life, the way he asks you to live, the way he asks you to conduct your life, the question, the tension that indicates how yielded your heart is to the Lord is simple. Do you believe God lays out this path for you? Do you believe God lays out his moral will for your life because he's for you? Or do you believe that God laid out these rules because he wants to keep good things from you? Now, when I say it this way, it sounds kind of dumb to even have a question here, doesn't it? I mean, if there is a God, let's just follow this logic for a moment. If there is a God, is it fair to say that that God would know a thing or two? He's been around a few more years than I have. Yeah, he probably knows a thing or two. And if that God made me, and if that God sent his son Jesus to die on the cross for my sins because he didn't want to spend eternity apart from me, is it fair to say that that God has my best interests at heart? So if there's a God in heaven who has your best interest at heart and he knows a thing or two, when he says, here's how I want you to live your life, not to earn my favor, you already have my favor through my son, Jesus Christ. Here's how I want you to live your life because I'm for you. I am for your flourishing as a human being. The tension is, do you believe that God is for you, or do you believe that when God says, here's how I want you to live, he's keeping something from you? You need to answer this question because this indicates whether or not your heart is fully yielded to God. Can you trust him? Well, that's Joshua's farewell speech. Those are his farewell words. And then he dies. And the flowers on his tomb are not even wilted yet when the nation takes its first step off the path. And it is so subtle, we almost miss it. But the narrator writes it that way because he's so brilliant. He wants us to see how subtle this first step off the path of flourishing really is. So in Judges chapter 1, here are the opening words of the book of Judges. After the death of Joshua, the Israelites asked the Lord, who of us is to go up first to fight against the Canaanites? So again, they've only settled in about half of the land. There's still Canaanites and their Canaanite culture living in there. Joshua's died. They're without a leader, so they do the right thing. They say, okay, God, which of us 12 tribes, because they're this commonwealth of 12 tribes, there's no central government, which of us 12 tribes is to make the first move now that we have no leader in Joshua? The Lord answered, Judah, one of the 12 tribes. Judah shall go up. I have given the land into their hands. So God gives a very favorable answer. Tribe of Judah, you fellas, you're first. You're the first out of the plane, and I am with you. I will give you success. Go get them. Now, this is pretty encouraging, you would think, that right after Joshua dies. The men of Judah then said to the Simeonites, one of the other tribes, their fellow Israelites, come up with us into the territory allotted to us to fight against the Canaanites. We, in turn, will go with you into yours. So the men of Judah say, hey, Simeon, we have an idea. Why don't you join forces with us and help us? That way we'll be a stronger army. And then we'll join forces with you and fight with you to have a stronger army, and everybody wins. Isn't that a great idea? Now, question, is that practical? Sure is. Is that reasonable? Sure is. Is that godly? Nope. Because it was a direct violation of what God said. God said, Judah, you go up and fight, and I will give you your territory. Judah, in turn, said, that's a great idea, God, but we see a better path forward. And God, it's very reasonable. It's very rational. It makes so much common sense, God. We're going to do it our way instead of your way, trusting what you clearly asked us to do. Do you see how subtle this is? It is so subtle. What they did was perfect common sense, but it was a complete lack of faith. Here's what happened. Here's the result. A few verses later. They took possession of the hill country, but they were unable to drive the people from the plains because they had chariots fitted with iron, which say, hey, well, what can they do? They're just a bunch of foot soldiers, but down in the plains, they have iron chariots, and those are like infantry going up against tanks in World War II. They don't have a chance. This is like, the Nazis invading Poland. They don't have a chance. So that makes sense. They did the best they could with what they had, right? Continues, how did the Benjamites do? The Benjamites, another tribe, however, did not drive out the Jebusites who were living in Jerusalem. To this day, the Jebusites live there with the Benjamites. Now, not 2019 to this day, but when this was written at the end of the time of the Judges. So he says to Benjamin, I want you to go up, take this land. Jerusalem's part of this land. Well, we can't take Jerusalem. That's an armed city. So we'll just take the rest of it. Well, we say, well, maybe they just weren't strong enough to take the land yet. Look at this verse. When Israel became strong, They pressed the Canaanites into forced labor, but never drove them out completely. Well, why should we drive the people out of the land? They can work for us. Why should we drive them out of the land? Do you know how much stronger our economy can be if we force them into labor and make them our slaves? And they'll get to stay in their homes then. They win. We'll get a stronger economy in slave labor. We win. Yeah, God told us to do that, but this is just so much more reasonable. This is a win-win scenario for everyone. Let's do it this way. Nor did Ephraim, another one of the tribes, drive out the Canaanites living in Gezer, but the Canaanites continued to live there among them. Hey, we don't even need to press them into slavery. Maybe we can. Maybe we can just make them servants. Maybe they can be the minimum wage workers. There's all kinds of opportunities here. Neither did Zebulun, another one of the tribes, drive out the Canaanites living in Kitron or Naholol. Just remember, when you're reading weird words in the Bible, just read them with confidence. Nobody knows. So these Canaanites lived among them. They didn't drive them out. They let them stay there. But Zebulun did subject them to forced labor. At every single turn, God says, here's what I want you to do. And their response was, gotcha, roger that. Except this one little area, it makes more sense to do it this way. In this one little area, we're going to obey the intent of what you asked us to do, God. But in this area over here, this is so much more reasonable to take this approach. Now, that's the summary of chapter 1. It kind of reads like the headlines. Here's what happened with Zebulun. Here's what happened with Ephraim. Here's what happened in Judah. But then in chapter 2 of Judges, in chapter 2, we get God's take on chapter 1. Judges chapter 2, verse 1. The angel of the Lord went up from Gilgal, and the reason why it says he went up from Gilgal, that's where Joshua had addressed all the people and said, be faithful to the Lord, and you will have success, you will flourish, you will be prosperous, but when you turn away, then bad things will happen. So it's like God's camping out at Gilgal. He went up from Gilgal to Bochim and said, I brought you up out of Egypt and led you into the land I swore to give to your ancestors. So the first thing out of God's mouth is a message of grace. Hey guys, did you forget who I am? Did you forget your history? Did you forget your past? Guys, don't you remember that your whole nation was enslaved in Egypt, and then I came and rescued you because I love you and I care about you, and I didn't want you in slavery, and I didn't want you in bondage. I wanted you to flourish. Did you forget what I've done for you? I brought you out of Egypt. It doesn't begin by lecturing them. It begins by reminding them of his grace and who he is. He continues. I said, I will never break my covenant with you. So guys, remember the promises I gave you, that I am for you and I am with you and I'm not going to forsake you? And I said something else. You shall not make a covenant with the people of this land. But you shall break down their altars. I don't want that kind of evil. I don't want that value system to continue in your culture. Yet, you have disobeyed me. Why have you done this? And I have also said, I will not drive them out before you. They will become traps for you, and their gods will become snares to you. So God's speaking to them, and the nation of Israel is like, God, you don't understand. God, you need to understand the situation here. We tried to drive them out, God. We tried to do what we could, but we were not able. Israel said, we were not able to drive them out. And God said, no, you were unwilling. But no, God, they had iron chariots. We couldn't drive them out. We weren't strong enough. They had iron chariots. God, Israel said, we could not. And God said, you would not. And this is where it hits home for us. This is where, in life, we get just a couple of degrees off course. Just a little bit off God's path towards flourishing. And it's so easy to justify it for us. It makes so much common sense to just go this way instead of God's way. For example, God says, remember how I've forgiven you? Remember how I sent Jesus who died on a cross? And when you were God's enemy, when you were so undeserving, I chose to cancel all your debt of sin against me. I decided to forgive. Do you remember that? Well, I want you to forgive the people who've hurt you, just like I forgave you. And some of you in the room today, you are looking right at God and saying, God, I'm unable. I'm unable. They hurt me too bad. The pain is too great. I'm unable to forgive. And God would look back and say, you're unwilling. But no, God, you don't understand how the pain. I cannot. And God would look back and say, no, you will not. God looks at our lives and how He's blessed us financially with so many resources in an incredible nation. And He says, but so many things in this world are broken and they break my heart. I want you to liberate your finances and generously make a difference with the things that break my heart. What breaks God's heart? God hates poverty. He hates injustice. He hates abuse. And He hates people who end up in hell. He doesn't want anyone to end up there. So He says, I want you to fund the people and resources and ministries that are making a difference in people's lives and eternities. I mean, at least 10%. Practice generosity. Make a difference with your few decades on this planet. And we look at our financial situation and you say, but God, you don't understand my financial situation. I'm not able to do that. And God says, no. You're unwilling to do that. But God, you don't understand. Things are so tight financially right now. I can't do that. And God says, no, you won't do that. See, that couple of degrees, that first step, that first turn, off the path that God has lined up for your life because He loves you and He wants flourishing in your life always begins the same way. A small rationalization, a little bit of common sense, a good reason why you are the exception to God's loving path for your life. That's where the nation of Israel took their first step off course in Judges chapter 1. And as we saw last week, and if you missed last week, all I can say is you missed last week. The destination at the end of that path is chaos and godlessness. And it all started by being just a degree or two off course. Here's how God wraps up this section. Judges chapter 2, verse 10. After that whole generation had been gathered to their ancestors, another generation grew up who knew neither the Lord nor what He had done for Israel. Then the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord and served the Baals. Now, it's not as if they never heard the name of God before. It's not as if their parents never told them what happened in Egypt. When it says they did not know Him, it means the experience of His love no longer mattered to them. The reverence they had in their hearts no longer was there. He's just some story about some God, and yeah, He's real and all, but they forgot. They forgot God's grace. They forgot God's love. They forgot God's mercy, and they turned just barely off course, but they went in that direction long enough where they had abandoned the worship of God, and they adopted the values of the pagan culture around them, which was godless and evil. Now, the first thing we learn from this, there's 4 fill-in-the-blanks to wrap up our time together today. All of them are important. The first thing we learn from this is this. Partial discipleship is an unstable compound. Partial discipleship is an unstable compound. Here's what this means. And this only applies to the people in the room who say, I'm a Christian. If you are not a Christian, this doesn't apply to you, but it's good to understand why hypocrite Christians frustrate you. Partial discipleship is an unstable compound. If you come to church and you sing the songs and you listen to the sermon, but you find that in your daily life you are justifying why it's okay for you to be just a couple of degrees off course with God, that's partial discipleship. That's compromised discipleship. That is saying, yes, I love God, and I'm going to use my own common sense and do things that my fear or my greed or my pride are telling me to do. What Judges teaches us is this is an unstable compound. You cannot live there very long, and you will go in one of two directions. Either you will listen to the pleas of Joshua and return wholly to the Lord your God, or like what happened to the Israelites, you will completely abandon the Lord your God. But you cannot stay in that in-between spot for very long. It's an unstable compound. The second thing this means, again, this is just for those of us in the room who are Christians. If you're not a Christian, this will give you some insight as to what Christians think. Second big idea is this. The greatest danger to Christian faith, the greatest danger to your faith in God, the greatest danger to your relationship with God is not atheism. That is not a threat to Christian faith at all. Atheism is just an alternative belief system. We'll go into that in another sermon in another day. The greatest danger to Christian faith is not atheism, but that we expect God to coexist with our idols. We expect God and demand that God makes room in our lives for the idols. What's an idol? Short version, God created a lot of good things, but when we take any good thing that God created and we make it more important in our life than God, that's idolatry. When I love something more than God, when I trust something for my security more than God, when something guides my path more than I allow God to guide my path, that's idolatry. It can take any form, any form. And the greatest danger to your faith is not atheism. It's that first step. Say, God, I want you to make room for my idols. I want you to make room for my idolatry in my life. So with that in mind, I want you to grab your cards that I drew your attention to at the beginning of the message. And I want you to take a quick glance at your answers. Odds are your answers to the questions are the places in your life where you have the highest propensity to create idols. To love something, to find refuge in something, to follow the direction of something, more than the voice of your Father in heaven. Doesn't mean you are. It means in your life, those are the places where you are most likely to succumb to idolatry. Those are the areas of your life where you are most likely to ask God to coexist with the things you truly love and serve and give your life to. Here's the question. Here's the Joshua moment of the morning for us. Two questions as you look at your card. First one is this. Am I willing to do whatever God says about this area of life? When it comes to the areas that you put on your card, the question you need to wrestle down is this. Am I willing to do whatever God says about this area of life? In other words, are you going to trust God's path, or are you going to lean into these things for your path? Second one is this. Am I willing to accept whatever God sends in this area of life? With whatever your answers are, whatever God decides to send into that area of your life, are you good with that? Are you good with that because you trust that He's good? Are you good with that because you trust He loves you? And if you're struggling with your answers to these questions, do you know what's true? You forgot. You forgot God's grace. You forgot His love. You forgot what Jesus did for you by living a life without sin, but then giving His life for yours on the cross because He loves you. You forgot. It all starts there. It all starts with God's grace. It all starts with His forgiveness. If you're struggling, the answer is not try harder. The answer is, this is the Lord God who didn't bring us out of Egypt. He brought us out of our slavery to sin and death to give you new life and new hope. So as we wrap up this morning, the band's going to sing a song. And this song is a reminder. It's a chance for you to remember, what has God done for you? To remember his incredible, incredible love for you, his unyielding, his unstopping, his never giving up love for you. And then, filled with that love, I want you to go home this week. I want you to take a look at your card, and I want you to answer those questions. Am I willing to do whatever God says about this area of my life? And am I willing to accept whatever God sends into this area of my life? And next week, finally, we're going to get to the fun part of Judges. We're going to start looking at the Judges. Let's pray. Father, sometimes your words in our life are hard to consider honestly. But you give us hard words so that we might be people with soft hearts to you. People who love you and trust you because you are good. Father, for everyone listening today, I ask that all of us would remember the nature of your love for us, and that your love, your goodness would change us. It would change our view of you, our understanding of who you are, the God of grace. I ask that we would have clarity as we think about our relationship with you and the idols that live all around us and the idols that live in our hearts. Give us the courage to be strong and courageous like Joshua prayed, to be strong and courageous, to trust you and not lean on our own understanding, because you truly want us to lead lives that flourish. Help us to trust you and then to obey. We ask it in the name of Jesus, our Savior. Amen.